Chapter 9. The Return. Panos, the stonemason, ambled along the main street of the village en route to the Platea, the grassy park at the end of the village. As he passed the restaurant, he nodded at the familiar old men who squatted on a long wooden bench outside of the crumbling wall. Except for the amber combalot beads they fingered, they reminded him of cats, purring with contentment in the mid-morning sun. Several feet from where they sat, a pair of rough-hewn wood beams were propped against the wall, where the brick had buckled and bulged and sent a spiderweb of cracks along the tarnished white stucco. Damage from the recent earthquake, he thought. But life continued on. Earthquakes and tremors were hardly more remarkable here in the village of Delphi than a heavy thunderstorm. A part of life. Birth, death, and earthquakes. One of the old men called out and asked him about his mother's health. That was about all the old men ever said to him any more. He was in the village, but no longer of it. He was another visitor, like the people who came to see the ruins. Only the old men knew him. They remembered Panos from another time. So he talked about his mother's health in terms they could understand. She feels much better now that her son and grandsons are here again. He smiled. She says she goes up and down. The old men laughed. It was what everyone in Delphi said when you asked how they were. We go up and down. That was life on the mountain. Up the mountain and down the mountain. The sight of the old men always made him feel good. They were the standard bearers of the village. It seemed they had always been there by the restaurant, waiting, watching, occasionally talking. He knew, though, that there had been a time when they were active, vital men, working and traveling up and down the mountain. Carpenters, craftsmen, merchants, shepherds. But that was before the shift, when the village was moved from atop the sacred ruins to its present site. Now the men were like the ruins of Delphi itself, their aged bones no longer able to support an active existence. He kept walking down the road as the men muttered amongst themselves. They were probably saying something about the accident so many years ago in which Estelle had died. Or, more likely, they were repeating an old story about what had happened afterwards. Estelle had been walking along a mountain trail carrying her infant son, Grigoris, when a landslide had buried both of them. Panos, who had been several yards behind, had managed to dig Grigoris from the rubble. Miraculously, he was unhurt, but when Panos reached Estelle, he cried out in agony and grief. Estelle, his beautiful young wife, was dead, her skull crushed by a boulder. That was the year of the shift. 30 years ago, he thought. The year the archaeologists arrived. The year everything changed. But out of Estelle's death rose a new life, his own. He was transformed, changed by her death, by the shift of the village, and by Milos, Estelle's father. As long as he had known him, Milos had been called the Crazy One, and afterwards he became even more crazy. But Panos learned to look beyond Milos's craziness, and slowly he came to realize that he was a seer and a guardian of ancient knowledge. Panos crossed the Placia and took a seat on his favorite bench. The square itself was small and unimpressive, but the view of the valley made up for it. After Estelle's death, he had spent endless days sitting at this very place and imagining himself soaring like a raven out over the valley. It was there in those days that Milos had approached him and told him that it was time for him to learn the secrets of the Order of Pythia. Nearby, two men in blue work clothes were whitewashing the base of an old oak tree to protect it from insects. He'd never seen either of the men, which was odd since he knew virtually everyone who lived here. Although he'd resided in Athens for several years, he still returned to Delphi several times a year to visit his mother and to be near the sacred site. He watched the men until the one closest to him looked his way. Panos nodded to him, greeted him, and asked how he was doing. The man paused, took off his cap, and wiped his brow with his forearm. He said he was fine, but that he'd never sweated in such cool weather before. The sun is hot, but the air is cool. That's how it is on the mountain. It's not like Athens, Panos said, quickly recognizing the man's speech as that of the capital. How long have you been here? Since yesterday. The government sent me. He puffed out his chest and spoke in a voice filled with self-importance. He watched Panos to see if he was impressed, but Panos let him down. He laughed and shook his head. So now the government sends men to tend the trees after we have an earthquake. Next time they will move the village again. The man's voice turned defensive. I am here because the king is coming to visit Delphi next week. Coming here? Panos was skeptical. The man smiled because he knew something that Panos, the local man, did not. Oh, yes, of course. He'll be coming to inspect the damage at the ruins, and he will stay for 2 nights. The man put on his cap and turned back to his work. Panos stared out over the valley, considering what he'd heard. He knew the king had a mountain retreat a couple of miles away, but he rarely visited it. Now he was certain the prophecy was right. The timing was perfect. Papa, there you are. Panos looked over his shoulder to see Grigoris hurrying across the square towards him. His son, now grown, was almost a duplicate of him. Muscular, with slender hips and dark curly hair. No doubt he'd just heard about the king's visit and was expecting to surprise his father. You won't believe it, Papa. It's happening already. Panos rose from the bench, took his son by the arm, and led him away from the workers. I know. Come on. How could you know? You've been here. I just talked to Stephanos outside the camp. Panos stopped and turned to face Grigoris. I told you to stay away from the ruins, and it's the first thing you did when I left this morning. I didn't go into the ruins. I stayed outside. She didn't see me. Neither did the foreigner. I was very careful. Panos shook his head. His son tried his patience. Grigoris had made a mistake in Athens when he'd let himself be seen at the Acropolis. Then, before Panos could stop him, he'd complicated matters by chasing the pair. I said I was sorry about what happened. How many times do I have to apologize? I'm not a child anymore. Now will you listen to me? What would you have done if they had stopped and waited for you? His son rolled his black eyes, exasperated. I told you I was just trying to scare the outsider. Maybe I would have told him to stay away from here. Panos stared at Grigoris a moment, silently reprimanding him. This is no reason to apologize to me. Apologize to yourself. He was about to invoke one of the sacred directives. Know thyself. But Grigoris interrupted. Father, the veil has parted. The vapors are rising again from the temple. What? That's what I've been trying to tell you. Are you sure? There was always mist around the temple of Apollo in the mornings, and on many occasions he'd imagined that the vapors were rising again, and the prophecy of the return had been fulfilled. I didn't see it myself because you told me not to go into the ruins, but it must be true. Panos knew that Stephanos thought Grigoris was naive. Maybe this was one of his jokes. We'll see, he said. What are we going to do? The younger man asked anxiously. We've waited many years. We can wait a few hours or a few days longer. Panos thought back to the prophecy. After Estelle's death, Milos had predicted the return and had given all the clues. At the time, Milos had been the last surviving member of the Order of Pythia, but over the years he had slowly passed the knowledge to Panos. Finally, the time had come for Panos to invoke his authority as the new leader of the Order. He would talk to Stephanos himself, but he already sensed it was true. It was finally all coming together. There was no longer any reason to fear Dorian Bellacamus because of her power at the sacred site. It was clear now. She was the one. She would be the new Pythia. He would be the interpreter. And the first prophecy, he was certain, would be for the king himself. And that's the end of the chapter. Hope you enjoyed it. Talk to you soon.